Welcome, everybody. We're so thrilled that you've joined us again. This week, we're going to talk about one of the most common things we see here at Amen Clinics that completely shocked me as a psychiatrist. We're going to talk about head trauma and all the different ways it manifests itself to mess with your mind.
Well, and one of the surprising things to me, which we'll talk about, was a shock to me because I'm a neurosurgical ICU nurse, so I dealt with TBIs all the time. So my idea of what a traumatic brain injury means was very different than what it means to you and what it means to our patients. So I want to talk about that as we go.
Right. I mean, you saw people that
with their skull flaps. We would take a flap, piece of skull out.
Have a projectile go through.
Right. We'd have brain drains, and I mean that's the stuff I saw. So I thought that's what TBI meant.
And that kind of TBI is so visible,
right,
that
we know
it's easy to see the consequences.
Right.
Where, super sad story this week, Kelly Caitlin, who was a silver medalist in the 2016 Olympics in cycling, killed herself, and a couple of months before had suffered a concussion along with a broken arm, and her family said she was just not the same. And so people don't think of concussions really as causing lasting brain damage. But let me just tell you a story. I learned this very early from the imaging work I do. And when I would see damage, especially to the left front side of the brain, that people would get dark thoughts, often suicidal thoughts. And I wrote a column in the local newspaper where I lived in Northern California in the Daily Republic on the connection between head trauma and suicide. And I was at my office late one night, and I got a call from a mother who was crying, and I actually stayed to see her that night. And she told me about her son, who was 16 years old, who had a bicycle accident the year before. Straight A student, good boy. And then after the bicycle accident, and they said he had a mild traumatic brain injury. His front tire hit the curb and he flipped over onto his head. And he was unconscious, but only for a few minutes. And she said after that, everything changed. He was mean, he was irritable, he didn't do well in school, and a couple of months before, he shot and killed himself. And she said, do you think that head injury had anything to do with it? Probably everything to do with it, because when you hurt your brain, you hurt your life.
Well, and depending on what part, right?
And
so can it really affect what kind of behaviors emerge? Is what I've learned
Kelly
from you.
Was one of the highest performers, right?
And she's going to Stanford.
Medalist, right, who's going to Stanford.
Her whole life in front of her.
Is a triplet, so connected to her siblings. And I have another friend, actually, who, when I filmed the show for CNN, Behind the Mind, I scanned the anchor, and she had a beautiful brain and was highly successful. But her sister, and they're twins, was not nearly as successful because her sister fell from a bunk bed from the top and had a significant traumatic brain injury. And very few people ask, well, this person's really successful and this person isn't. Well, it's because they don't care or they're not motivated. And I just want to tell you, it's way more complicated than that.
But let's talk for a second, because like I said, a lot of people have this idea that it has to be really bad. You have to lose consciousness. You have to be in the hospital. And when you go to the hospital, they'll often say, oh, go home, you're going to be fine. Even if you had a concussion. That happened to my mom recently. She had a really bad fall, which now, 2.5 years later is still affecting her life. She had a brain bleed. And they told her she was fine, and they sent her home. It was crazy. So this happens all the time. Let's talk about the difference, though. What about for people who never go to the hospital, who never lose consciousness, who never realize or
You mean
believe
like Tana Amen?
yeah, that they had a brain injury. Because that never crossed my mind. And I think so many people who are hearing this are going to go, wait, I didn't know that qualified.
Well, and one of the biggest lessons I learned early on about traumatic brain injury is people forget that they've had serious
Because they don't
ones.
think of it as a traumatic brain
And
injury.
so I saw a new patient yesterday, and you could see the damage in his frontal lobes and in his temporal lobes. And I'm like, so when did you have a head injury? He goes, oh, I didn't.
Mm-hmm. See?
And sort of like when you and I had first had that discussion,
Yeah.
and I went, are you sure? Did you ever fall out of a tree, off a fence, dive into a shallow pool? And
Car accidents.
he told me from 13 to 19, he was basically abused by his older brother,
my gosh.
who would take his head and smash it into the linoleum floor.
And so you could see the damage on the scan.
I can see the
But
damage
he's
on the
not
scan.
recalling it because he's not thinking of that necessarily as a brain injury.
Right.
He's thinking of it as his brother beating him up and how many kids get beat up.
Correct. So whether you were beaten by a baseball, whether you're in a car accident, whether you had concussions playing sports. I remember when we did the Logan Paul video. And if you haven't seen it,
It's very
you
funny.
can Google it. It's about 14 minutes long, but it's worth watching. He comes
Especially if
in
you've got kids. It's helpful.
and he's so insightful because
And you wouldn't think of that if you've seen his other videos.
No, you wouldn't.
But he actually was.
But he comes in and he says, I want to know why I'm an asshole. And I'm like,
You're not
I
supposed to say that out loud.
I so wish so many of my difficult patients would have that kind of insight. But he said, I want to know why I struggle with empathy and relationships.
Connection, right.
And he played football for 4 years and he was really good. So even if he had a concussion, the coach would want him to continue playing. And he fractured his skull
Dude,
in
that's a big
7th
one.
grade in a trampoline accident. So as you stay with us, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the symptoms. And many people have traumatic brain injuries. Well, they sort of get better over time, but they can leave a lasting mark on you. And then we're going to talk about, well, what do you do about it? And so many people go, oh, well, don't do anything for a couple of months.
Right. Wait until it
And
heals.
Remember in our grief
And
podcast, we talk about when do you start healing
right.
from grief is as soon as you can. When do you start healing from traumatic brain injury? As soon as
Well,
you can.
and you look at how critical it is because I mean this poor girl who had her entire life in front of her killed herself within a couple months.
And if we would have seen her, if we would
You would give
have
her hope.
scanned her, we could show the problem, and then we would have started to put her brain in a healing environment. But many high achievers, she's a very high achiever, and she actually, if we did a neuropsych test on her, she may have scored in the normal range, but she wasn't normal for her.
Right.
So it may have taken her IQ from 130 to 115, and she may have absolutely hated that.
Right. She might have been
because
slower.
she knew she wasn't as good as she was.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're a perfectionist, that can really drive the darkness in your head. Now you have a review. Thank you for listening
Yes, thank
to our
you.
podcast. We are grateful.
Yes, we love the reviews. So this video gives so much food for thought. No pun intended. Thanks a lot for your help. We definitely need to reconnect with our body, our brain, and with one another. And he's referring to the video with Dr. Perlmutter, which was amazing. We love having him as a guest. And I cannot figure out how to pronounce his name.
Romesh Kanadi.
Kanadi. Okay, so thank you so much for that.
All right, stay with us. More on traumatic brain injury shortly. Welcome back. We hope listening to the Brain Warriors Way podcast soothes whatever brain injuries you've had.
For sure.
You soothe me every day.
I was just going to say the same thing.
Do you have a review you want to
I
read?
do. So this is from Laura Louise. Excellent. Self-care first. Then we are more able and available to do the rest of life in a quality-paced fashion. Love that. We're always telling people that.
So, new research published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal shows that even mild concussions sustained in ordinary community settings might be more detrimental than anyone anticipated, except me. The long-term risk of suicide increases threefold in adults if they've experienced even one concussion. Additional study reiterated the seriousness of traumatic brain injury, stating it is the leading cause of death and disability in young adults in the developed world, and that individuals with mild TBI, think concussion, had an elevated risk of suicide by 81%.
Wow.
The link between TBIs contributing to poor outcomes later in life was recently investigated in much greater depth. Research published in PLOS Medicine studied more than 1 million people born since 1973 and followed them to see how head injuries impact their lives in the coming decades. And what they're going to find, there's a higher incidence of depression. There's a higher incidence of ADD. There's a higher incidence of learning problems, a higher incidence of panic disorder, a higher incidence not only of suicide, but also homicide. There's a higher incidence of divorce, incarceration, bankruptcy, because when your brain works right, you work right. And when your brain is troubled for whatever reason, such as a concussion, you have trouble in your life.
Right. I certainly witnessed that with my mom, and that was not her first concussion, but this one was bad. And
No,
it just
it's like
really
number
changed her
10
life.
for her.
Right. And it really changed her life.
Right. The first time I scanned her, I said, "Hey, did you ever have a head injury?" She goes, "No."
She
And
was
then
calling
she went
me.
and told me about all
Well, dear
of
Lord,
them.
she was still calling me 3 weeks later. Oh, I forgot to tell him about this. Oh, I forgot to tell him about that accident. I'm like, that explained my whole life growing up.
So why do they ruin your life, and why does no one know about it? Because they end up having emotional problems, so panic attacks, depression, suicidal thoughts, relationship problems, domestic violence, and they go see therapists. And because most therapists have never been trained about the brain, and even psychiatrists never look at the brain, you then assume it's depression. So let's say, so I saw somebody yesterday and they had low activity in their frontal lobes and low activity in their temporal lobes. And he goes to his family doctor, he even goes to a good psychiatrist, and he goes, "Well, I'm depressed." And he meets 6 out of the 9 criteria. Right. So he gets a diagnosis of depression and they put him on an SSRI. That's the standard first thing to do. Standard first thing to do is they put you on a serotonin, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And what does serotonin do in your brain? It calms it down.
Drops your frontal lobes.
If you have low frontal lobes to start,
it could ruin your life.
Someone drops them further, it can actually disinhibit you.
And ruin your life.
You get a thought, "Oh, I'd be better off dead." And then you make a suicide attempt because your frontal lobes, which are also involved in empathy, doesn't see the pain that it's going to cause other people.
Yeah, no, it's ridiculous. They put me on an SSRI and it was terrible when I was going through my depression. I took myself off of it. They tried to double my dose when I told them I didn't think it was working. Crazy. But I wanted to point something out because you mentioned earlier that most therapists are not trained to deal with the brain. So just to FYI, because we're going to get inundated with people going, "Well, but my therapist isn't, what do I do?" We actually do have a network on our website of people who are trained in our work. So just want to put that out there.
Yeah, and you can also come to one of the clinics because, as I always say, how do you know unless you look? If you've had a concussion or a fall or a car accident and the traditional things you're doing are not working, someone should look at your brain. If people go, "Hey, Daniel, single most important thing you've learned from 150,000 scans is mild traumatic brain injury ruins people's lives. And nobody knows about it because most therapists aren't looking. So in the study we published in PLOS One, that got downloaded a gazillion times, we did a world literature review on SPACT and traumatic brain injury. There were 1,600 citations. So let's stop saying there's no science behind the imaging work. 91% of times it affected people's frontal lobes. So
if there was no science behind it, why would they use it so much in research, and why do we use it in the hospital? I'm just curious.
Because they didn't know about the science, and if somebody doesn't know about it, they say there's no science. Anyways, 91% affects your prefrontal cortex. So, well, what kind of problems would you have if you hurt the front third of your brain?
Judgment, impulse control, lack of empathy. Being overly spontaneous to the point of being impulsive. Your executive function would be impaired.
By executive function, it's sort of like the boss at work.
Right. Or a parent.
Or a parent. And if
you can't effectively parent yourself.
Right. So it's basically the part of your brain that makes decisions. And if you've hurt the prefrontal cortex, the decisions you make might not be as good. You say the first stupid thing that comes to your mind, which can get you into all sorts of hot water if you're married, especially to a redhead.
Why do you always say that? You're going to make them think I am so mean.
You're awesome. I married you. I married you because I love you and because you're awesome.
I noticed you choked on that I love you. Are you afraid of me?
Absolutely. Right? You have elevated my fear. But
no, I've elevated your frontal lobes, let's be clear.
I don't know if you've elevated them or stunned them.
I hope we make better decisions.
But think about it. Decision making is involved in everything in your marriage, in your health, in your money, in your work. And so if your prefrontal cortex is hurt, the decisions you make are not as effective, and that can damage every area of your life. And one of my favorite stories is Jose, who I was on the Dr. Phil show.
Now, see, he should have been afraid of someone like me.
He would have.
He would have been afraid.
Right.
Yeah.
We did a show on Dr. Phil about cheaters, about people who were unfaithful in their relationships.
But repeatedly.
And he had cheated on his wife 8 times in a couple of years. And Dr. Phil said, my dad said if you see a rat, there's 50 more behind the wall. So he's like, there's probably more to this than Jose was admitting. And he had low frontal lobe function in a traumatic brain injury pattern. And I'm like, do you ever have a brain injury? And he said, no. And I'm like, and I go, are you sure? Have you ever fallen out of a tree, fell off a fence, dove into a shallow pool, been in a car accident, played sports, having concussions? He said, well, I'm a mixed martial artist. I'm like, okay, that'll do it. And then he played football for 4 years. And then he said, and I break bottles with my head. I'm like, what? He said, yeah, it's sort of like a party trick. I can take a beer bottle and go boom against my forehead.
I would have broken a bottle over his head.
Yes, you would have.
Yes.
That is true. We'll talk about your traumatic brain injury in a little bit. And so the first thing for him, it's, well, what do you want? Because some people want a promiscuous lifestyle. I said, but he wanted to be married.
Right.
He
just don't be married to someone who doesn't.
Child to grow up in a broken home like he grew up in. And so if he knew what he wanted, and clearly his behavior was not getting what he wanted because his wife had a loaded gun at home and she was ready to use it on him. She was angry. But still that didn't dissuade him. What I needed to do was get him to know what he wanted and then fix his frontal lobe probes, which we did with diet, exercise, supplements. We'll talk about that. And they're still married. And now I think it's like 8 years later,
Yeah, it's
he's
amazing.
got his nurse anesthetist
Yeah.
degree. I mean, he finished
So he got his master's degree.
college. He got his
Yeah,
master's
see, that's
degree.
amazing. So, you hear about a story where someone was unfaithful once, but it wasn't a chronic situation, and you can heal from that over time. But when someone does it 8 times or more, or it's just a chronic situation, you have to ask yourself, what's going on? And they're doing it because they don't want to. Now, if it's because that's the kind of relationship they want, then you should just be with a partner who has the same values you do. But if not, then you have to, you hear it all the time, like, why?
When your behavior is not getting you what you want, you should be thinking about the brain. And now, hopefully, after listening to these podcasts, you're going, oh my goodness, I fell out of a second-story window when I was 7. Do you think that counts? Probably. Stay with us. When we come back, we're going to talk about more, especially healing from traumatic brain injuries. Welcome back. We're talking about traumatic brain injury and all the ways it can mess up your life, and including decreasing empathy
And judgment.
And what I've found that the scans do is they increase the empathy of the people who are with them.
And that's critical, because if you think about, it would be so easy to get, like you would say, to get really angry and take it out on that person or leave that person, or if you're talking about if it's a domestic partner, but even if it's your child. So, even seeing one of my child who didn't have a brain injury, but it just helped me understand behavier so much more
See her
clearly.
scan.
And then seeing my mom's who did have a traumatic brain injury really helped me understand why. It helped me understand my entire life, actually, but it really helped me understand her.
So in another study, people who suffered even a mild traumatic brain injury, which was defined as a head injury which left them feeling dazed or confused, were 60% more likely to have died in the study period than those who had no injury. Even of more concern, there was a 91% more likely to have been hospitalized for psychiatric problems. 55% more likely to have done less well in education. 52% more likely to have needed disability benefits. And it's estimated that there are about 2 million emergency room visits for traumatic brain injury every year in the US, in addition to hundreds of thousands of unreported incidents of head trauma, including undiagnosed concussions as it relates to sports. Research shows undiagnosed brain injuries are a major cause of depression, anxiety, drug and alcohol abuse, homelessness. There's a study from Toronto. 58% of the homeless men in Toronto had a significant brain injury before they were homeless. 42% of the homeless women. And females who have frontal lobe injuries, like hitting soccer balls, have significantly more disability than men who have frontal lobe injuries, because the female brain, 90% of her IQ is in the front part of her brain.
Amazing.
For men, it is more widely distributed.
So when I'm hearing this, what I'm hearing, besides how many lives are ruined, is this is a massive drain on society. So as far as, our resources, this is treating brain injuries would be far more effective than treating the after effect, than treating the consequences. So that's crazy.
Do you have a review?
I do. You guys are awesome. Thank you. Love listening to all the content you put out. It has helped me so much, and with my ADD and life. Thank you. That is from Pat Quest. Thank you so much.
We love the reviews. Please keep sending them in, because that way we know you're listening. There's just so
we're not
much
talking
to talk
to
about.
cyberspace air.
So some of the common symptoms of concussion, confusion, memory problems. We had that issue recently in our family, where someone just sort of forgot their day.
Yep.
Difficulty with concentration, difficulty with word finding, mental and physical fatigue, sleep problems, sensitivity to noise and light. Remember the Irlen syndrome we talked about? Moodiness, anger outbursts, anxiety, social isolation, vision problems, balance problem. So I said 91% of people it affects their frontal lobes. About half of them, they have less activity in their cerebellum. So
They're likely to fall again then.
They're likely to fall again,
'Cause that's
increasing the
coordination.
risk of another concussion.
So as I'm reading this, because we've dealt with several people in our own family who've had these symptoms and had head injuries. So many people are told or somehow believe that it will be over with in a month or two. And that's not always true.
It depends on how severe it is. So there's actually a SPEC study by Jacobs, 1996. They looked at if your SPEC scan after a traumatic brain injury is normal, you have 100% chance that you're going to do fine. But if your SPEC scan right away is not normal, then it's actually not predictive. What's interesting is your scan at 9 months, if it's still troubled at 9 months, because the brain has a lot of healing mechanisms, if it's troubled at 9 months, it predicts you're going to continue to have trouble unless you go and rehabilitate the trauma.
So things like hyperbaric oxygen.
So it's all the things we talk about in this podcast.
Oh, I see. You're going
right?
to, I see.
It's
so
the
he's going
bright
to
minds intervention that we talk about repeatedly.
We're going to talk about interventions in the next podcast, correct?
Well, we can do it anytime.
Because the nurse in me is like,
your beautiful brain wants to talk about it. But basically what I want you to think about are 3 things. If you've had a traumatic brain injury, brain envy, you got to care about it. It runs everything. Right? Why I've been able to be married to this incredible woman is my brain lets me know what I want, kind, caring, loving, supportive, passionate relationship. And I act like that because that's what I want.
And it really does help because as somebody who didn't know this work before, when you start to see this work and you start to see, oh, okay, this is how certain foods affect my brain. This is how alcohol affects my brain. This is how anger affects my brain. This is how, like, you begin to
Negative
see
thinking.
things through a different lens.
Right.
And so you begin to behave differently.
Brain envy. You have to care about it. The second thing is you have to avoid anything that hurts it. And you just need to know the list. This is why you do not, let me repeat, you do not let your kids play tackle football.
But my kid wants to.
You do not let them hit soccer balls
But they want to.
with their head. Yes, I hear that. So I was at the Future of Medicine conference, and a friend of mine who's a billionaire says, but my son wants to play. In fact, I went and hired an NFL coach for him to teach him how to play football. And I'm like, so let me get this straight. Because he wants to do a brain damaging sport, you're going to allow him. In fact, you're going to get him a great coach. But what if he wanted to do cocaine? What if? Would you go find him the best drug dealer, the highest quality drug dealer you could? Because the level of damage is about the same.
See, that's crazy.
And I've scanned 1,000 cocaine addicts. And I've scanned probably 20,000 people with traumatic brain injury. And the level of damage is about the same.
So we have a friend who's a neurosurgeon who said the same thing, essentially. His son, a neurosurgeon, and he knows. He actually agrees with all of this. He's like, yeah, but you got to let them do what they want. And I'm like, here's my philosophy. You give kids the most amount of control that is safe and reasonable at the age that they're at. And if they're not making good decisions, your job is to be their frontal lobes until they are, right? But you don't just let them do whatever they want.
And on the informed consent that parents have to
sign.
sign, you have to take responsibility. It does say death. But what it doesn't say is if you allow your children to play a contact sport where they are likely to get a concussion, that they're not going to be
As successful.
Or
as
That's
happy.
not there. That their grades may go down, that their likelihood of getting divorced will go up, that they'll actually have 4 times the level of depression, that's from my NFL study, as the general population.
If you
It
watch the
doesn't
movie
say
Concussion,
that.
it's pretty...
You need to protect their brains until theirs has developed. So I say this a lot around here at Amen Clinics. We need to be our patients' frontal lobes until we fix theirs. And as parents, you need to be your child's frontal lobes until theirs develops. And it's not 18. It's more like 25. So having them, we've had this discussion recently about, I'm actually a fan of kids staying close to home when they go to college, at least for the first couple of years, because their brain is nowhere near finished developing. And when I was 18, I went into the Army, but it was sort of like the good mother, right? It was
The very strict mother.
structured, and when you did the right things, they promoted you and gave you more money, and when you did the wrong things, they thumped you consistently, predictably, reliably.
Yeah, they're pretty strict.
So, brain envy, that's number 1. Avoid anything that hurts it, including sugar. There's this fascinating study from UCLA where they gave mice head injuries. So they whacked them in the head, poor mice. And one group of mice, they gave them a really healthy diet. The other group of mice, they gave them the really healthy diet plus fructose. And 3 weeks later, the group with the really healthy diet could run a maze that they already knew how to run. The one that got the added sugar were still confused. Isn't that interesting? So the standard American diet, SAD, that is filled with sugar and foods that quickly turn to sugar, is delaying your ability to recover from a traumatic brain injury. Brain envy, avoid anything that hurts it. Do things that help it. Stay with us. When we finish this week on traumatic brain injury, we're going to talk about our healing program that we do at Amen Clinics.
Welcome back. We are on day 4 of Traumatic Brain Injury Week, and we're going to talk about interventions today. So this is a really good one. If you've had a traumatic brain injury, you're going to want to listen to this. Do you want to read a review before we do that?
Marshall Maxwell. Dr. Amen, thank you for your knowledge and sharing with the general world. it was interesting listening to your interview with Tom Bilyeu. I had a question for you about cannabis use, and I know you mentioned it ages the brain prematurely. Is it due to overstimulation of the cerebellum or frontal lobe? Intuitively, if the neurons are firing at a faster rate, then more wear and tear. That's actually really interesting. I think over time, it decreases blood flow to the brain, and that's why it is toxic. And it's not just smoking. What we actually found, it was more toxic to the brain than people who smoke cigarettes. So we also showed decreased activity in the hippocampus, the brain's major mood and memory center.
Interesting. And that was with cannabis without the THC?
No, cannabis has THC in it.
Oh, I'm sorry. What am I? I'm thinking of CBD oil.
Right. CBD generally.
You can tell I'm not a marijuana
Generally,
Right.
no THC, but sometimes it does. And we've unleashed CBD onto the general population. People are giving it to their dogs. And there's been virtually no study. So I know the NFL has toyed with the idea of using marijuana as a treatment for traumatic brain injury.
So let's
No,
decrease
we're not
the
there.
activity even more.
So let's talk about healing. If
Yeah.
you've had a traumatic brain injury in your life, what are the things? So brain envy, we talked about it. Avoid anything that hurts it. And if we think of our Bright Minds risk factors, all of those are there.
So when in the last episode, you talked about sugar, but it's really about eating a diet that supports brain health. And that's what we really did in Brain Warriors Way and Bright Minds. It's the same diet. And that, in fact, that's the cookbook you promote in Bright Minds, is the Brain Warriors Way cookbook. It really lays it out very clearly and easily and gives you a path. How do you do this? Because people are like, okay, but it's hard to eat without putting sugar in your diet. It's hard to eat without a high grain diet that it quickly turns to sugar. It's actually not. Okay, so I've got hundreds of recipes that help you achieve that in a simple way. But that's critical to putting your brain in a healing state. If you think of nutrition, it's like the number one thing in your life. You eat all the time, right? So you eat all day long. So you want to be eating things that are going to support healing. And that's one of the things you can do. And then we have supplements and things like that as well.
So here at Amen Clinics, we did the big NFL study at a time when the NFL was sort of in denial that they had a huge problem with traumatic brain injury. And we've scanned and treated about 300 players now. 80% of them get better when we do this, a multiple vitamin with higher doses of B vitamins. Multiple vitamin, high dose fish oil. We use 5.6 grams of fish oil with about 2,800 milligrams of EPA and DHA. And then we used a brain boost that worked in multiple ways. So ginkgo and vinpocetine to boost blood flow, phosphatidylserine to help with memory, huperzine A to help with acetylcholine. So we're really using supplements in a sophisticated way to nourish their brain. And that was super helpful. The other thing was hyperbaric oxygen. And how did I learn about hyperbaric oxygen? My friend Mike Usler from UCLA, who also does SPECT scans, showed before and after scans in people with hyperbaric oxygen showing improved blood flow. I actually published a study with Paul Harch from New Orleans on soldiers, and we showed not only did it increase blood flow, it decreased it improved concentration, it improved their memory, it decreased symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder.
So two things. Number one, to your supplement regimen, which I know that's what the study was done on. I just can't help it. The nutrition person in me is just like dying to jump in. You need to have your vitamin D checked, because if you're feeling depressed or anxious, you need to be optimizing your vitamin D as well. And I always recommend probiotics.
Well,
It's
so
just a
let's
must.
just quickly go through the Bright Minds risks and interventions, because that's what you do with traumatic brain injury. So B in Bright Mind stands for blood flow. What we often see on scans is low blood flow. So things like beets and rosemary can increase blood flow to the brain. Ginkgo vinpocetine as far as supplements, and hyperbaric oxygen.
Right.
Anything that decreases blood flow makes your traumatic brain injury worse.
So the hyperbaric oxygen, I just have to, this is actually kind of funny. So apparently it works so well. I want to actually use it more. But apparently it works so well. A couple of our like celebrity patients who, decided that it's easier for them to get one put in their home. Didn't I hear that they were asking if they could sleep in it?
Yeah.
Because they felt so much better, right? So it was like, oh, can I sleep in this thing? I'm like, can you do that?
It's not recommended.
But that's how much
you
better
can
they felt.
spend up to 4 hours a day
Okay.
in a hyperbaric chamber. And the first thing that our football players said is their sleep got better, because sleep is often.
Well, and that was the point, was they not only slept, these people I'm talking about slept better. There were two of them I can think of, slept better, but they felt so much better during the day when they did that. So yeah, I was like, oh, it must make a big difference.
The R is retirement and aging. When you stop learning, your brain starts dying. And it used to be that people said, oh, people with traumatic brain injury should not do anything, should basically go in a dark room for a month and not do anything. And no, you should be using your brain, just not to the point where you trigger symptoms. The I is inflammation, and 97% of people are low in omega-3 fatty acid. Often they have a high C-reactive protein. So the big intervention is fish oil. Get your gut right. So you had mentioned probiotics, and also curcumin.
So probiotics for your brain. Who knew? Now that's the big thing on the horizon. That's like what everyone's talking about.
We talk about that all the time, about your gut brain health. And the G is genetic. So if you have a risk for Alzheimer's disease, you actually, traumatic brain injury generally is much worse for you. It can actually accelerate your risk. And people know about President Reagan, and some people say he had it in the White House. I'm actually friends with somebody that was in his White House. He said he absolutely didn't have it in his White House. But right after he left the presidency, he fell from a horse and had a subdural hematoma. And then it really accelerated a process that may had been brewing. So genes are not a death sentence. They should be a wake-up call for you to get healthy.
Yeah.
H obviously is head trauma. Don't get another one, right? So do not ski without a helmet. Do not do stupid things. And it's often on the ski slopes where it's not you.
It's someone else.
It's the other people
Happens
that
all
make
the
it
time.
risk.
But it's not just sports. I mean, people don't really think about this, but as a nurse, I can't help it. I'm out. I was a trauma nurse, and whenever I'm out, I'm like, I just see head injuries happening everywhere, like before they happen. I can't help it. But people just aren't paying attention to certain things because it's not in their daily routine. It's something I was sort of trained for. I mean, the big thing that we watch for, that we're so scared of, is, older people falling. So you've got to make sure that your pathways are clear, that you don't have steps, that you have got night lights, that there are just so many little things like that because once you've had a brain injury, once you've had a fall, you're more likely to fall.
Because it hurts your cerebellum,
Right.
so you're not quite as coordinated. Protect your head. T is toxins, and we're loaded with toxins with legalizing marijuana everywhere. People think alcohol is a health food. I'd kill the pot, kill the alcohol. Scan all of your personal products so you're not putting parabens and phthalates on your body. They're hormone disruptors, and we'll get to hormones in just a minute, but they're often low in people who've had traumatic brain injury. Almost all of my NFL players had low testosterone. Imagine that, right? These massive sex symbols, really, but many of them complain of seriously low libido.
Interesting.
The M is mind storms. So it used to be mental health, but in my new book, The End of Mental Illness, it's about mental illness. So I changed M to mind storms. So it's really abnormal electrical activity, often secondary to a traumatic brain injury, where it damages your temporal lobes. There, the ketogenic diet actually can be really helpful. You don't want to let your blood sugars get too low because that can trigger off one of the mind storms.
In severe cases, don't you sometimes use like an anti-seizure medication?
All the time.
Yeah.
all the time. I'm a huge fan of Lamictal and Neurontin and Trileptal for my patients who have mood instability, irritability, anxiety, temper problems.
So if they're treating people badly in their lives or...
And they often, people who had a traumatic brain injury often get misdiagnosed as having bipolar disorder when they really don't have the traditional highs and lows. They're just sort of irritable all the time or anxious all the time. That's often secondary to traumatic brain injury.
That's so interesting.
The I is immunity and infections. So cleaning up your diet, often going on an elimination diet can help. And if you're not getting better, getting screened for herpes and Lyme.
So what about
and
someone who's had, so I
toxoplasmosis.
had mono when I was little, when I was young, very young. But ever since then, apparently that stays in your system.
So you'll have markers for
Right.
Epstein-Barr virus, and it sort of wore out your immune system a little
Right.
bit.
So because I've always wondered between that and all the other stuff I've had in the kids, but I've always wondered, why do I get sick when no one else, like if I'm around anybody sick, I get sick.
And so you want to keep your vitamin D level
Right.
at a high.
And I do
level.
better now.
And for immunity, you want to cook with mushrooms
Right.
and onions. And you use a lot of garlic,
Right.
which I'm grateful for.
Lots of onions and garlic. I use lots of herbs and spices.
The N is neurohormone deficiencies. Often multiple hormones are low, and people have had traumatic brain injury. So getting them tested and optimized, killing the sugar, lifting weights can be helpful.
So do you remember when my mom had her fall? It literally shut down all of her hormones. Now I remember that happening in the hospital sometimes, but those were, like we talked about, severe brain injuries. My mom's was pretty severe, even though she was never
It was
hospitalized.
really severe. She had a subdural hematoma.
But she was never hospitalized. So that's a common thing though, right? It can shut down all of your hormones.
It's very common.
And some people don't know it, and they wonder why they feel so terrible.
Yeah, no, my friend Mark Gordon and I were in a new movie called Quiet Explosions about how replacing your hormones can make a huge positive difference in your life. D is diabetes. It's just rampant. So as Tana keeps saying, get your diet right. S is sleep. When you get your sleep right, things just get so much better. So my book, Memory Rescue, goes through all of these in great detail. Tana's cookbook, The Brain Warrior's Way.
So one thing I want to say about sleep is that when you do, this is one of the main things I hear with teaching the nutrition classes, is that as you do all the other things, the sleep gets better. So it will, and as your sleep gets better, then you have more resistance and you start to do better in other things. But it's like this circle. But as your diet gets better, as all these other things get better, your sleep gets better.
And there's specific things you can do: melatonin, magnesium.
We have a great podcast.
Hypnosis.
We have a sleep specialist. One of our doctors is a sleep specialist.
Dr. Criato.
He's
We actually have
amazing.
a brand new sleep course coming, so stay tuned for that. We hope this has been helpful. Such a common issue, but you're not stuck with the brain you have.
There's hope.
Even if you've been bad to it, you can make it better. We can prove it. Stay with us.
If you're enjoying the Brain Warriors Way podcast, please don't forget to subscribe so you'll always know when there's a new episode. And while you're at it, feel free to give us a review or 5-star rating, as that helps others find the podcast.
If you're interested in coming to Amen Clinics, use the code PODCAST10 to get a 10% discount on a full evaluation at amenclinics.com. For more information, give us a call at 855-978-1363.